So good morning, everyone. This is Michael Cerny from Zurich Insurance. This meeting is now being recorded, so a formal welcome to the third out of the 3 webinar sessions on PERC training. Today's moderator will be mostly Karen McClune from ISET. So I'll just check, Karen, if you can hear us and if you're ready to take over from here.
Yes, all good.
Great, thank you, Karen. So again, we'll try to keep lines open and make this as interactive as possible, as I will be sharing my screen here as well so you can see the presentation. Please be diligent in muting yourself if you're not speaking to avoid background noise. Otherwise, I will have to stop the presentation, go through the participants list to identify the noise and only then be able to come back on, which would be a nuisance for everyone. So please just keep that in mind. So with that, I will share my screen and start the PowerPoint presentation. And Karen, you can get going if you want to and tell me when to advance slides. Oh, that was not the right one. Sorry, I just did something wrong here. How do I go back? Ooh. That's very interesting. Sorry for that. Just want to move this out of the way. There we go. All right. Karen?
Okay. So I think, welcome all. Glad you could join us for the 3rd webinar. The content today is primarily just sort of a look back, a review of some of the key points that we've covered in the first 2 webinars, a chance to discuss and reflect on what we've covered, and then we have a number of mini PERCs that people have done that we'd like to present on and just reflect not just what you learned, but sort of how the process went. So Michael, if you could advance. And you know us, we're the presenters again, advance. So in terms of bringing it all together, what we've presented, you've had the PERC manual, and we've asked folks to do, sort of to based on what we've presented, do a mini case study as a chance to really ground truth what you've learned. And then we'll sort of go through, what you've learned and what we've learned in doing these and kind of how it comes together. Michael, if you could advance. For us, what we wanted to make sure people came away with this was kind of what's different about the PERC, because it does occupy a different space than a lot of post-event reviews. And we've really aimed to sort of communicate that what's different about it, both in these webinars and in the manual. And part of why it's important to really understand that distinction is because if you're going to conduct one, that's the first thing people ask. And many of you may have already learned that. Well, what are you doing and how is it different? And the more interviews you do in conducting PERCs, the more often you run into that. Well, we already have people looking at post-action reviews. Why should we talk to you on yours? You're not even from here. But it's both a strength that we're often not from the area because we see through different eyes, but it's also that very broad perspective that makes it different. And I'd like to just get people to chime in. As you've listened through these webinars, as you've looked into the manual, what have you seen about the PERC that you feel occupies a different space than what you've done before? I'm going to let anybody who wants to unmute themselves and jump in.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, it's Bart.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Are you just joining us?
I'm sorry, were you talking to me?
Yeah, I had just tossed a question out to folks, so I'm not sure if you're just joining us or if you're answering the question.
I am just joining us. It has been a ordeal getting to work today. Another matter altogether.
Glad you made it.
So this is Peter Haig. I'd be glad to jump in and get the conversation going. Clearly there are plenty of different frameworks to look at a disaster, and so you're absolutely right that it's a legitimate question. What does make a PERC different? And I would have to say that there probably are other approaches that could be used, but clearly the high-level approach, the detailed approach to do your primary research as well as your secondary research and integrate the two, the framework that you've developed looking at institutions and the 5 Cs and so on, I think provides a great framework. So I think it's extremely well thought out, and it does look for those the trigger points that create the actual disaster. So at the end of the day, you should be able to stand back and give a very good overview of what the different existing infrastructure was, what was the existing institutions, who was engaged, who was affected, and so on. And all of that is kind of two-dimensional in a way, but then you should also be able to identify specific trigger points when something turned from an event to a disaster. And I think that's where the lessons are. And I think that's one of the areas that makes it truly unique. So I guess the only question would be to the extent to which the lessons are actionable. And I'm still getting my mind around the whole process, so that's where I am at this point.
Nice, thank you.
And this is Dan Gorham from IBHS, and I think the gentleman before me really articulated what I was going to say much better. And just to kind of follow up on that last point, that I think that the PERC model is very valuable, and I've learned a lot over this process, and I'm really intrigued. And I think the biggest question that won't necessarily be answered now, but this has been good fodder to get the gears rolling of what role can the PERC play in kind of your arsenal of post-event reviews, and what questions is it capable of answering, and are those questions that I have.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Well, for me, this is Bart Shacknow. What I love about the model is the emphasis on collaboration. You know, this is the kind of thing that's usually relegated to experts. People have, you know, engineering degrees or things like that. PERC, to me, at least, strikes me as the heart and soul of it is collaboration between citizens, you know, community stakeholders, yes, professionals, quote unquote experts. I love the collaborative government officials. I really love the collaborative aspects of it, and the emphasis on we're all in this together. If our communities are to be resilient and best prepared for calamities and in a position to recover fastest, we all are in it together. So it's the collaboration piece important to me and most distinctive about PERC.
Nice, thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, great. Hi, everybody. Jen Schneider. As I was doing the research, I think while I don't know this is different, I do know it really helped me was to start with the hypothesis in mind and think about how, as you're researching and doing the desk research, you're trying to find those new learnings. So it became very clear as I started to read different articles about the disaster I studied that you can start to see the trends and just making sure we're not just providing information that necessarily it is relevant, but also trying to find a way to pull out a nugget that's new. So that was something that I found really interesting as I started to do some of the self-study work on the disaster.
That's great. Anyone else? Okay. Someone else? Or shall we move on? Everyone's being very quiet. Okay, we'll move on. So so in the webinars and in the manual, we went through sort of applying that sequence. What do we actually do? What are the steps? So identifying an event, conducting the desk research as mentioned, and then combining that with a really broad group of interviews with a broad range of different players. And, here on the slide, we have plan and conduct field work. There's some initial planning, but it's also snowball sampling. So, you get a framework in place, some initial contacts, you start there. But a lot of it is sort of emergent as you're doing the work and how it comes together. And, every interview we've ever done, we tend to conclude with, and who else would you recommend we talk with? Which has been really interesting because often you kind of get the sense that you're starting to come full circle and you've got a fairly good picture because when you ask that question, the people that are recommended are people you've already talked to. And you realize, okay, yep, we're starting to come back around. We caught a lot of the really key players here. Putting together some sort of report or, assembling the story basically and being able to, based on that story, develop the kinds of outreach materials that you want to use to influence, to actually take the PERC learnings from a study into something that will actually change behaviors in the world. And then, activating that sort of suite of materials, getting them out into people's hands, and having the discussions that sometimes people need to help interpret. So what would that mean? How would we use that? And through all of this, the challenge is really asking open-ended, learning-oriented questions, to not come in with a standard list of check the box, here's what we're going to ask these interviewees, to not even necessarily have a lot of expectations about what you're going to hear from any one person, but be open to their story. And it's really that being open to people's stories that allows it to be collaborative and allows us to surface things that are sometimes not said or not really well surfaced in other kinds of post-action reports or risk analyses. And then based on that, how do you sort of articulate, so what does this mean? And the comment that what questions can PERC really answer, and the extent to which recommendations and lessons are actionable, that's something that we, in the studies we've done, have always done a sort of read between the lines. There are a lot of contexts in which there are clear gaps in preparedness and response and recovery, but there's a reason. There is not the political will to act on those. There is no political system that could act on those, you know, depending on the cultural context in which the study is run. And at some point, you need to be able to tailor the recommendations and learnings that you're putting out to those realities. And so we often think about, how can we frame this? Where, if this is the challenge, is there a realistic entry point for action? And how can we present that learning or that recommendation in the light of where there's someone who could actually start making traction around it, rather than just put out what will be perceived as fairly unactionable, you know, openings. So, well, yes, you know, the reality of doing PERCs and the reality of the way these natural events become disasters is because of the places where people haven't looked, because of the places where people haven't been willing to act. And so how do you work with that? And how do you try to see the cracks in the armor, as it were? Where could you suggest, yeah, the entry point might be here? Michael, next slide. The way we go about, as we've discussed, finding those cracks in the armor, as it were by using the system thinking approach, looking broadly, not just looking at any one item. Well, there was a failure of a levee. Well, why was there a failure of a levee? It wasn't maintained. Why wasn't it maintained? Well, it wasn't maintained, you know, because of these political realities and because of cost-cutting measures and because of, well, why did it matter if it wasn't maintained? Well, because people had built right behind it and they weren't aware that they were right behind a levee, that there was a danger there. And so when information went out like, well, the levees are weakening on the news, no one put that together with, that might mean my house is at risk. You know, that's the sort of digging and digging and digging that we try to do around every piece of a PERC study that we engage in. And with that is that understanding vulnerability. Well, if we have a levee that might fail, who is at risk? And if they're aware, they might not be at risk. Some of their assets, their removable assets might be at risk, but they personally might be much less at risk. And if their movable assets are at risk, but they knew that, and they've got flood insurance, they might be in pretty good shape. It's the lack of awareness that can put people at risk. It's the lack of communication that can put people at risk. You know, they might be aware that there's a risk, but if no one communicates, oh yeah, that levee is not as solid as we thought, there's a chance of failure. And there are actually people in the disaster management arena in that area that know that information but choose not to put it out. That's creating an unnecessary risk and an unnecessary vulnerability. And it's those sorts of issues that take what is a natural hazard and make it what we've termed here an unnatural disaster. It's a disaster that in many cases didn't need to happen. There are certainly natural hazards that, because we have chosen not to build to events of that size, are fairly unavoidable disasters. And people will still frame that as a natural disaster. And I would say it's in part about the thresholds that we choose to build to. That we know we're putting human settlements and assets and infrastructure in a risk landscape, and we've said that we'll build to the 100-year flood, and that's good enough. Well, we know floods aren't going to stop there. And so that's the point at which, you know, yes, if it's larger than a 100-year flood, it will be a disaster. We kind of know that. and yet we still react with surprise when we get those extreme events and they overtop everything that we built for.
Can I make a quick comment here, Karen? Is that okay?
Please jump in. Absolutely.
So if I have said it in this environment here before, then please take that as a repetition and reinforcement. If not, then I hope it's a good addition. But the way we spend money is really, you know, a key challenge at the moment. And that's exactly, if you think back, our resilience definition, where we start trying to combine various dialogues and various investment needs. So resilience is really the idea to be able to achieve your development objectives, so to go where you want to go, despite that there is a risk out there. And what we see in reality is, of course, as you know, that money is still being spent elsewhere and too late. And what we also see is that there's effectively 3 silos where, you know, different money is being spent and therefore creating competition. So we talk about investment decisions and business decisions that need to be made. So people want to invest in a new facility and new products and whatever. People then realize at some point that these investments have been put at risk due to being located in a flood zone or inappropriately protected. And then you need to, again, find some new money to protect that investment, to make it risk-informed. And then at some point, as you start thinking more long-term into the future, the whole climate change challenge comes into play as well. So how do we make sure that the levee that we wanted to build for the 100-year standard is actually still good for a 100-year standard if under climate change, the wave action at the coastal resort is being twice as high. So obviously that's then meaning, despite nothing else changing, in 50 years' time or in 30 years' time, actually my investment is now only good for a 50-year return period flood event rather than the originally intended 100. So we kind of see these 3 separate dialogues where new money again is being needed, but actually that should all be streamlined into one. So what we also want to highlight with PERC is this, and that's probably going back to the systems thinking, that you can stream these decision processes together so that you achieve risk-informed and climate-smart development and you know, investment at the same time. So that's what I wanted to point out here. So back over to you, Karen, and I'm not sure if a new joiner is currently unmuted, but there is some new background noise. If people can still be muted, please, and check. Karen?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, can people check their mute? That seems good. Thank you. Yeah, and just some of the other key pieces, as noted on the slide, the local context, the local perspective, the local experience, the grounded reality of the event is super important, and it's different everywhere. Even among the PERCs that we've done in the U.S., the local context makes each one really different. And so, particularly if you're coming in as an outsider, spending some time to really understand, like, what is the cultural context in which this event unfolded, and how do vulnerabilities play out a little differently? What are the assumptions that are made about disaster risk reduction or disaster management or risk perception in general? How are these different from other places you've been, and really surfacing those so that you get that nuance. And using that nuance, not just to sort of deepen the study, but to tell a compelling story. For me, that's a huge part of what really sets PERC aside, is it goes beyond just the facts, what we should do about them, but it sinks into how did this all come together? What were the different threads that were needed to make this event happen? here. And what does that mean about the opportunity moving forward and the challenges? And so then, based on those opportunities and those challenges, where could you build resilience? And what do we see? And how is that both unique to this location and yet consistent across multiple locations or across the full body of the PERCs? And so finding both those individualities and the commonalities in the disaster risk landscape. Next slide, Michael. So we have, I think, 5 different case studies that folks have sent in, and we want to go through these now and have people just present their work and talk a little bit about what you did, what you found, and what you learned in the process. So next slide. And our first one is Chris and Susan. Would either or both of you like to take the lead? Tell us what you did.
So this
Hi
is
there,
Michael,
can everybody
so please.
hear me okay?
Yes, hi Susan, we can hear you. So I take it that you're taking the lead on this wildfire study. We have just received another one probably 5 minutes prior to the call, which we haven't been able to embed in the slide deck. I think that has come from Daniel Gorham. You were also looking at the California wildfires. So maybe my suggestion would be that after Susan and Chris have presented, if you have anything to add, that you speak up then, so we make sure we profit from your work as well, if that's okay. So Susan, over to you.
Hello, everybody. This is Susan Homan, and along with my colleague Chris Fetterman, we're from the DuPont company in our Performance Building Solutions business, and we actually chose the Paradise, California, and the wildfire study because just in the course of some work we're doing, we've had the opportunity over the past couple of days to be having discussions, interviews with folks on this very topic here in California, so it was very timely. The 2 interviewees that we're going to be referencing some information from that provided input to this mini case study is a gentleman named Craig Savage. He's a building and construction expert specializing in temporary high-performing dwellings. More specifically, he's one of the project leads on the Sonoma wildfires, just providing temporary housing that can be that's not trailers. It's really more around high-performing small homes that can be quickly deployed in the aftermath of a natural disaster. So the other person that we interviewed is Karen Lacrone. She's an architect and with the firm Ari Lacrone, specializing in fire-smart architectural design. She's based in the Santa Barbara, California area, but does work across California and Hawaii as well. So next slide. So just to give some context, I think it's been very broadly publicized, the events of last November in Paradise, California. And just a few facts that came from our desk research. It was the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California history to date. If you look at the fire itself, after exhibiting extreme fire behavior through the community of Concal, an urban firestorm formed in the densely populated foothill town of Paradise. And that's where we're going to focus with respect to this wildfire that was named Camp Fire. The fire caused at least 86 fatalities, 3 persons still missing, and injured 12 others, including firefighters and apparently prison inmates. It covered an area of over 150,000 acres and destroyed over 18,000 structures, with most of the damage occurring within the first 4 hours. And this campfire was the most, as mentioned, the most destructive wildfire in history. Total damage was $16.5 billion, and 1/4 of the damage, $4 billion, was not insured. And the fire reached 100% containment only after 17 days. So it was, quite a challenging fire to, to manage and eventually put out. So I'll stop there for a moment, or should I move forward? Okay, so the key learnings, we kind of separated them of learnings in the category of prior to and during the event, and then learnings, excuse me, on the aftermath or post-event. Real challenges continue. So on those that are associated with the event, one very key learning was that if you look at Paradise, California, there's really only one way in and one way out, one road, and it's bound because of the natural environment. It's if you look at it on a map, it's a finger out on a ridge bound by canyons, and so very difficult to have multiple roads, or nearly impossible in and out of the town. Another key learning was that a couple years prior to, they narrowed the road in some places from 4 to 2 lanes, and it was really intended by the city to beautify, improve pedestrian safety, and they even added bike lanes to create a more pedestrian-friendly town. And then obviously with there's a tightening in the road. It created traffic jams during the event in spite of the evacuation plan. A second one, key learning, was around there's just too little notice or warning to the residents. They had, from a prior event, 10 years prior, there was a very similar experience, but not so devastating, but they had the community had developed an orderly evacuation plan that failed the later residents that were in line. In other words, as they the people that got out first were spared, and unfortunately, with the wildfire being so fast-moving, those that were in line later were not so lucky. Many residents did not get appropriate warning to begin with. There weren't any evidence of sirens. It was, they did have a text message system. There seemed to be delays, and even with door-to-door notice, it was spotty at best. And the third major point was around there are available protection measures, but they're not broadly applied. I mean, there's quite a bit in California, just I call it PR, just publicity around measures that you can take to save your property and your life versus wildfires, and that's has to do with keeping the growth, your landscaping growth, certain distances away from your home. There's other measures, ventless roof systems, resilient claddings that are available, and they're just not broadly applied, and they weren't in the case of Paradise, California. So then on the post-event side, there continues. It really was a slow start to clean up and rebuild, and what people out here in specifically the two that we spoke to, that the city officials are almost paralyzed. They, if you talk to those that are in decision-making positions, they're really not willing, because they're numb from the trauma and just the well, I can't speculate that it was, post-traumatic stress necessarily, but they're not willing to make decisions quickly enough. And certainly that includes in building permitting. It's been a slow process and really compounded by the cleanup is still it has still not been a hasty cleanup, so they can't rebuild until all the debris, which is, they said if you drive into Paradise, it's just ash everywhere and molten metal, with one exception of what remains standing, and those are the fireplaces and the chimneys. So that's pretty interesting. But the cleanup is provided by private companies, and they're not the local or either city or state. And so there's also that reality of supply versus demand. It's they're kind of beholden to these private companies to come in quickly and get things sorted out to begin that cleanup and rebuild. There's also if I mentioned earlier about the cost of this disaster, and that a significant number of residents did not have insurance. So this relatively low rate of insurance in a very high risk area, it's believed that the high cost of insurance has kept some people, from buying the private insurance. Then on the other side, to the insurers, it's again, it's very high cost. And in fact, one company dropped very quick, soon after the event. 6,200 clients were dropped by one company, just because of that, how costly and high risk for the provider themselves. Then the last point we'll make is that code upgrades may not be applied in rebuilds, and it was, and here we are in this call, but it's really timing is the priority to get people into homes, and in many cases, the code upgrades that have taken place since the buildings were built or insured have changed, but yet there's not necessarily this the real underlying premise is just get people into their homes quickly, and the upgrades are not necessarily being applied. And then secondly, insurance coverage may not cover the cost of the code upgrades. And an example was provided that now in certain communities in California, driveway turnarounds are mandatory. And in the case of Paradise, there were many cases of where people just couldn't get out, with the traffic jams, and even rescuers and relief workers. It was very difficult for people to move about because of people not actually having turnarounds in their driveways. So those were the key learnings that in this very quick study that we felt were most significant. If you move on to the next slide. A few practical recommendations that apply to to some of the learnings and insights that can be drawn as a parallel. Well, for one, the suggestion was to transfer the liability away from the city officials, to with sign-offs perhaps from product engineers, architects, et cetera. As mentioned, this paralysis or numbness with the city officials to make decisions has been, very prevalent. And allow people to move more quickly on bringing forth the upgrades and innovative solutions in the course of the rebuilds without having lengthy and lengthy discussions with the city officials and this consternation that is continuing with respect to those trying to make improvements even on the ground now. The second recommendation would be around needing more effective measures to evacuate the residents more quickly. They, as I mentioned, they had a plan. It was, I don't know all the details, but we were told it was a staggered evacuation, and it failed many residents. The wildfires, they moved very quickly, and it just wasn't a sound plan. And along with that, they need to revert to an earlier plan to widen the entire road from 2 lanes to 4 lanes. It was this was a mandate from a grand jury investigation from a previous wildfire, the one that I mentioned that was occurred 10 years earlier. And the town, it was mandated that they widen their road, but then somewhere along the way, people, forget about the reasons why. And there are sections of town, as I mentioned, where they decided to, kind of squeeze the road, make it 2-lane, put some bike lanes in and other features to make a, more resident-friendly community in places. And so they deviated from something that was all, prior had, been determined would be a way to alleviate some of the jams, the traffic jams in the event of another disaster. And then thirdly, we would say that a warning system needs to be upgraded. For example, perhaps there's a community siren or something that quickly notified, had the ability to notify all the residents to evacuate, in much more timely manner. So that is it. I've tried to go through this quickly, and taking into account that there are others waiting. So that's what we have.
Nice.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Susan. My suggestion would be, unless Karen, you have another approach, that we hold back with feedback until we have heard all the presenters, and then provide collective kind of, feedback and do a bit of a debrief rather than do it individually. And also watching the time, thanks, this was really comprehensive. If other participants maybe can try to limit it to, 7-8 minutes, so that we can really give the floor to everybody who has provided their mini PERC. Karen, any other thoughts?
No, that sounds good.
Great, then I'll just move on. And this is Meryl, Mark, Reese, and Bart. If someone of you wants to take the lead, please.
Sure. Hi, this is Marley with SVP. So our group focused our mini PERC on Hurricane Sandy, and I'll just provide a little bit of the background here on the storm. The Hurricane Sandy made landfall in October 2012. It was a Category 3 hurricane that downgraded to a tropical storm before landfall. The damage from the storm affected over 650,000 homes and led to 8 million customers losing power in the region. In today's dollars, we found this with an article that compared it to current storms. It caused over $70.2 billion in economic damage. What was unique about the storm was that FEMA declared a disaster before landfall. Because of the Post-Katrina Reform Act, they were able to do this when they considered the potential for the storm. They were able to put some resources in place. This allowed them to put the critical immediate response resources like medical and safety and food items in place in strategic locations for them to mobilize within 48 hours after landfall. One of the main issues that came from the storm was mass flooding in the region. And that caused the power outages that were felt because the equipment and machinery of Con Ed were kept underground, so they were flooded and damaged. And the power outages impacted infrastructure throughout the city and the region, which included mass transit, roads, bridges, tunnels, and commercial and residential buildings, and that really affect the residents living there and their ability to get help and recover in those immediate days following the storm. One thing that a lot of the articles pointed out on this was that in New York City, when elevators aren't working because of power outages, it causes a significant issue for residents that are living in the really tall buildings, and that's not something that I would have considered living in Houston. So I thought that was interesting. And one thing in the response that was notable was that FEMA funded the Sheltering and Temporary Essential Power Program. With this program, they fund residents so that they are able to return their homes to be habitable immediately after the storm. And so it's not a full rebuild of their home, but it does allow them to remain in their home until permanent repairs are made. And this helps to keep people in the community and reduce the displaced number of people from the storm so that people can stay in their homes and continue to get help in that way. Now I'm going to throw it to my colleague, Mark, who's going to cover our key learnings.
Thanks, Marley. This is Mark Smith with SVP. So some of the key learnings that we had is that the flood insurance rate maps were out of date. So residents were not adequately informed of their risk, especially in the southern parts of Brooklyn and Queens, the Coney Island, Rockaway, those areas that were coastal facing. Many of the homeowners there were really unaware of their flood risk, and those areas saw significant storm surges in some places over 10 feet. Previous false alarm of weather events by public officials led to avoid many residents to not take the necessary precautions and not leave the area or heed the evacuation warnings. So Hurricane Irene, which occurred the year earlier, had been a highly publicized potential disaster, and many people took that situation very seriously, as it was one of the first times that a hurricane had really approached the greater New York metro area, as well as the New Jersey area in decades. And that caused many people to leave the area, but due to the high cost of hotel rooms and the high cost of transportation in the New York metro area, people were hesitant to do that again for Hurricane Sandy. And that created additional challenges in that many people were trapped in their homes due to the flooding and due to the damage of the infrastructure, which only made it more difficult and led to the need for higher amounts of search and rescue. So the infrastructure investment had been lacking prior to the storm, and as a result, it took greater capacity for the city to respond, and people were trapped in what became remote areas. So areas over, I believe, I don't have the number in front of me, I believe over 6 bus stations and 7 subway tunnels in the greater New York metro area flooded. And many residents in New York are highly dependent upon these forms of public transportation, and so they essentially became isolated. With the lack of power and the lack of any public facilities or resources being open, people really became trapped on islands. So since then, the investment in infrastructure has risen, but it's still inadequate to deal with a Sandy level like event. And that's really across the board in New York. And then historically, machinery and equipment such as boilers have all been located below ground, both when we talk in terms of businesses and in residential. And so this led to not only damage to those that machinery, which further exacerbated the response and left the people without heat or water or electricity, but it also increased the cost of repair for the long term. And then many residents were either underage or uninsured regarding their national flood insurance coverages. Many, especially residents thinking that their homeowner's insurance would cover them for a flood event or not anticipating a flood event because of the rarity of a storm of this nature. And so many people lack the resources to rebuild. And then we're left hoping for assistance from other forms such as philanthropic, federal funds, or state assistance. And now for our recommendations, I'm going to hand it over to Bart.
Thanks, Mark. So we have three categories here with regard to the recommendations: citizens, community leaders, and businesses. I think one of the most important points to emphasize is there's a need for collaboration and working together. So it's not as if these three separate groups of stakeholders, all have to work on this on their own. We have to work together. I would also throw in a fourth category, and that is the media as well. I think, Karen, you had said it, lack of awareness and lack of communication puts people at risk. And we in New York, I'm a native New Yorker, have had some problems over time, and we haven't worked them all out yet. So Hurricane Sandy is one example of it. We were not as prepared as we needed to be. Back in 2010, when Mayor Bloomberg was in office, there was forecast a major snowstorm. The snowstorm really kind of didn't happen, and that, really led to credibility problems because the city really ramped up for it and word got out and all that kind of stuff. And when it didn't happen, just people started to doubt. It was just a little boy crying wolf kind of situation. More recently, this past November, we had a little dusting. We couldn't have had more than 2 inches, I think it was on a Friday, and it virtually shut the city down. I mean, there are stories of people who took 12 or 14 hours to get home. Some had to stay in their offices. And, the takeaway for me from that is that should have been a call to action. So Mark, conveyed already that, we still have problems with infrastructure here. If anything should have been an alert that we still have work to do, it was that we had trouble coping with a light dusting. So again, it gets back to the need for the various stakeholders to communicate, to engage, to collaborate, to work together as a team. The media has a tremendous role to play. And I think another point is that we tend to understate the magnitude of risk. As an insurance company, we're kind of biased. We think that most people are or underinsured. In other words, they don't have the right type or the right amount of insurance. That's a biased point of view. But we do see it, pretty consistently over and over again. We talk about businesses need to partner up with qualified advisors, their brokers, their insurance companies to put together a business continuity and resilience plan. Quite frankly, we will consider them unfavorably from an underwriting standpoint if they haven't taken those steps. If they haven't prepared for a crisis, emergency, a natural or a man-made catastrophe, because resilience is really important there. So the recommendations, with regard to citizens, I've added the media, community leaders, and businesses, are pretty clear here. But I think that the watchword, if there are major themes, are communication, collaboration, engagement, teamwork is important. It can't be done in the aftermath of a storm. Kind of has to be done on an ongoing basis. That's it for us. Hello?
Hello, can you hear us?
Thank you very much. We can hear you. I just hoped we can just move smoothly on to the next one without an intermezzo. So this one is the Fort McMurray, Canada fires. So can I ask participants from ICLR to take this over, please?
Hi, yes. So this is Bohan. I am from the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction in Ontario, Canada. And with me is Kenzie. And so if you can go to the next slide. So we're talking about the Fort McMurray wildfire in 2016. And it's actually very interesting that the Paradise wildfires last year were presented earlier. So it'd be good to kind of compare, contrast these two wildfires. So the population of Fort McMurray, it's kind of a remote northern town, supports a lot of oil sands. It was about 66,000, but that was sort of the official census numbers, and the municipal census reported a higher number of about 80,000. And there's some differences in the methodologies, but you know, it's roughly that population. And again, this is a remote northern town supporting oil sands, you know, oil pipelines, forestry, and tourism. And so the fires began on May 1st, and the fires likely had a human cause at the beginning, but however, the conditions were really right for this. So there was a lot of hot, dry weather, and there's high winds that contributed to the spread of the fire. And so originally there was a little bit of mixed messaging around whether the fire was going to be a danger to the town or not. And so there was an initial evacuation order, I think, fairly shortly afterwards. But on May 2nd, you know, the evacuation order was rescinded. But finally, on May 3rd and 4th, it became apparent that the fires were going to be a danger to the town. And so the mandatory evacuations happened over these 2 days. And this actually, the evacuation order was finally lifted about a month later, starting June 1st. So again, about 88,000 people were evacuated in the region. This was the costliest insured disaster in Canadian history, so about $3.6 billion in property damage. I think some sources said about $10 billion damage in total. But the total insured losses, you know, I think insurance covered about 70% of the sort of eligible damage. The other nice thing about the Fort McMurray wildfire was there were very few casualties. So only there were no fatalities or injuries from the fire that were reported, and the only reported casualties related to the wildfire were actually during the evacuation due to a vehicle collision where 2 people unfortunately died. The other thing that's interesting to note from the Fort McMurray wildfire was that only about 10% of the structures in the city were destroyed. And there was also one oil site lodge that was destroyed as well, so 665 units. And if you take a look on Google Maps, there's actually, you know, some differences between the Fort McMurray town and the Paradise town, where there seem to be clear boundaries between the forest and the city in Fort McMurray, whereas in Paradise it seems like the forest just intersperses with the town. So that might have contributed to some of the lower losses. And I'll turn it over to Kenzie for the key findings and recommendations.
Yeah. All right. So for our key findings, or our key learnings, these are based on our desk research as well as an interview with our colleague Glenn McGilvery, who is the managing director here at ICLR. So the first key learning is that wildfires will become more common in a changing climate. So in the area that Fort McMurray is in, as Bohan mentioned, at the time of the wildfire, the weather was much warmer and drier than it usually is in May of 2016, which made the conditions rife for the wildfire. And though it was likely human caused, it could just as easily have started by lightning. And the next point is that embers are the greatest danger to towns and buildings. The embers land on roofs, and therefore the roof design of homes is extremely important in areas prone to wildfire. Next is that towns can survive wildfires. The buildings that followed fire-smart procedures had higher rates of survival. As seen in the Fort McMurray wildfire, the evacuations were effective. It wasn't necessarily very organized based on what I read, but they were very successful in getting everybody out in a timely manner. But I think that they can basically learn from what they did in in the wildfire in Fort McMurray to help them in future instances. And then lastly is the point that Indigenous communities were largely neglected during the Fort McMurray wildfire emergency response. And this was mostly due to a lack of communication, but it also had to do with culturally insensitive evacuation procedures, as well as a lack of trust and sensitivity that was already existing between these communities. And next, I'll go to the recommendation. All right, so we broke down the recommendations into resilience, response, and recovery. So in terms of resilience, we said that it would be ideal to have fire smart standards adopted for all buildings going forward to reduce the chances of loss to wildfire. Response, in terms of response, there needs to be better emergency preparedness training and evacuation planning for emergency response personnel as well as the community members. And improved communication between all levels of government and the Indigenous communities to ensure that everybody is receiving fair treatment and ensuring that everybody gets out safely and that certain groups are not being neglected. And recovery, we need to focus on critical infrastructure and ensuring that these are protected as well. And then lastly is encouraging insurance uptake to make sure that the community members have a better ability to recover and rebuild quickly. And then lastly, the last slide is just our references. Thank you.
Okay, this is Peter Haig. I looked at Ellicott City, which had a major flood event. You can go to the next slide, please. So this was a case where it's located in Maryland, just outside of Baltimore. This is an interesting case. It had an extremely high rainfall in the space of 2 hours, so 9 inches of rain, massive flood. I didn't get a number for the exact cost of the property damage, though the recovery costs are in the neighborhood of $80 million. But there was one casualty for a first responder trying to make a rescue. A couple of things contributed to the event. So in addition to getting 9 inches of rain, they had rain prior to the event. So the soil was already fairly wet, and the runoff was fairly pronounced, you might say. Also, the town is in an area where you have 3 different streams coming together right at the town. So historically, that made it a perfect place to put a mill. So it's an old mill town, historic mill town. So you can imagine running a grist mill of some kind. But it also created the conditions for potential disaster. In addition, the town has kind of evolved around the streams. So you've got literally the streams are coming right through the town. Buildings have been constructed over the streams in some cases. I tried to capture a few pictures of culverts that were coming out from underneath buildings or underneath a roadway, many of which are aging, haven't been updated for many years. Another contributing factor was the rapid onset. The fact that rain was falling, people could see the creeks rising, but before they knew it, it had turned from a heavy rain event to a massive disaster in a very short period of time, again, because of the heavy rainfall. They're a contributing factor, though it's very unclear whether it was the deciding factor. I don't think it was, but a contributing factor was land use change with increased development, more impervious surfaces in the watershed, particularly up from the town. And as we've heard from other disasters, communications were problematic. It started off just kind of collegial, hey, it's raining pretty hard, hey, the creek's coming up. The police and fire did get some emergency warnings out. interestingly enough, the Weather Service had predicted that there could be a heavy rainfall event the day before, 24 hours in advance, but authorities didn't get that word out in an effective manner. And then you could see that the communications took on a more of a panic kind of tone as the creek became more and more overriding its banks, you might say. So communications were definitely sporadic and not necessarily all that helpful in some cases. Couple things that I think make this interesting in kind of the PERC context. One is that they had a record flood, 5 inches rain plus, just 2 years before. So they were on notice that this was a problem. Anyone looking at this town could have said, hey, you've got 3 creeks coming into one area. The town is at risk. We saw this movie 2 years before. So that was the first thing that I think makes it somewhat interesting. The other thing, and here, this may be a little bit of a stretch, but to me, what you've got are areas that are prone to flash floods. So it's not Houston. It's not a massive flooding event over an entire metropolitan area. It's more, if you look at the D.C., Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Baltimore area, the Weather Service and others have identified 6 or 7 of these pockets where flash flooding occurs. And I just felt that this is maybe putting a microscope on just one of them, but also calling attention to disasters that could affect multiple areas in a given area. So let's go to the next slide, if you can. Okay. So what are the key learnings? By the way, I went up to see the terrain. I interviewed a couple of the shop owners. I interviewed a friend who's a resident who lived in town, but since moved up to one of the new houses that is up in the watershed. So they can attest to the land use change, and they agreed that that was a problem. In fact, I heard that from several residents. But there's also one culvert in particular that got clogged up, and quickly the creek overran its banks. So a couple of things. So despite the previous event, people were not prepared. Climate change and other weather events are changing. So what we think of as a 1,000-year event might now be a 100-year event. There were environmental studies and engineering studies performed after the last event, but interestingly enough, 2 years is not enough time to implement those changes. And the sense of urgency that the county moved forward with, or the city, wasn't necessarily sufficient to meet the need. But on the other hand, you have to account for civil process, community engagement process as well. So these things take time. And it's one thing that we might want to think about in terms of how we expect communities to move forward quickly on recommendations. So that's one of the things that is kind of a takeaway for me. Obviously, land use changes, we see that pretty much throughout the U.S. You guys can read these, but again, the communications were confusing and not necessarily helpful. So I think we've heard this from others as well. The evacuation plan could have been improved. So let's go. Oh, I did want to point out the hydrograph on the bottom of the slide. It's, it just doesn't get much more dramatic than that. You've got rainfall, 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 and then this one day it just completely goes a straight line upwards. So let's go to the next slide. So a couple of recommendations. First of all, it's kind of a matter of psychology or sociology, but just to get people thinking, hey, I'm in a floodplain, I'm in a flood zone, we might want to revise the way we think about where we live and how we live, and make adjustments for these type of events in the future. So it's one thing to have an improved communication plan, but I think it's also another to have people actually respond to that plan and understand what the ramifications are. Not everyone who moves into the area, say over the next 5 years, will have it in their memory that this flood occurred this past year. And so there needs to be a certain socialization to, where you are, situational awareness perhaps. The alert system clearly needs to be improved. I have this idea that it could almost be like a fire or a smoke detector in your house, where when the flood or when the stream hits a certain level, businesses and others, maybe an alarm system where it's audible alarm of some kind, but definitely needs to be improved. And there definitely needs to be better approach to closing off the city at times of high rain events. They do have a master plan, and when you go in town, they have all these signs saying, let's implement the plan. So basically, everybody knows they need to implement the plan. It is now fully funded. It involves upgrading some of the culverts that were problematic. It involves actually acquiring and removing some of the buildings that have been built over the stream and have caused some of the damage in the past. So they have done a very good job of planning for the future, and they've actually done a pretty good job of somewhat futuristic approach to using public spaces as a flood zone. So they're taking out a parking lot, for instance, and it will act as a way to pool some of the water in a future event. They are doing other things such as containing rainwater and creating retention ponds and so on. So that will help. But the main thing they have to do is actually get it funded and move it forward. So, and I guess you should know that they have allocated, I think it's $50 million in the past year's budget from the county, so they are moving forward. And in the material that I saw and the outreach that they've done to the community, they're making a strong effort to communicate a sense of urgency. So I do think that they're addressing some of the issues in a proper way, but it remains to be seen how effective it will be going forward. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next would be Jen, actually looking into PERC Florence. Jen, if you want to unmute yourself and take us through your slides, please.
Yes, thank you. Next slide. As you can see, I chose Hurricane Florence. Overall, the highlight for the hurricane, after doing some of the desk research is that the legacy of Florence is the flooding rainfall. It is actually the 8th wettest overall tropical cyclone in the continuous United States. The event occurred in September 2018. There were 30 direct lives lost and 23 indirect from the hurricane. It had approximately $18 billion in damage, which most of the damage was primarily caused by freshwater flooding. 5 billion of those damages are actually insured. At least that's the last number I saw from RMS. So doing the math there, that leaves close to $13 billion in coverage gap. And then, as you can see, approximately $550 million were paid out from the National Flood Insurance Program claims. But what, as I mentioned, as I started this, is that the real legacy is this flooding rainfall. There was this unexpected intensification on September 4th and 5th. It was turning into a Category 4 major hurricane. It had these maximum sustained winds of 130 miles per hour, and it looked like it was going to hit at that level. But when it made landfall on September 13th, it actually was down to a Category 1 storm. there was a rise in high pressure that caused Florence to stall for several days when it did make the coast, and that just allowed it to dump rain on the community from September 13th through the 15th. So if we can go to the next slide, Michael. So the key learnings here, what's, obviously so devastating, and I think this is something we may see from other of our post-event reviews, is that when Florence hit, many of the residents there were still trying to recover from Hurricane Matthew, which occurred 2 years prior to Florence. As somewhat unfortunately expected, as we know what occurs here, those same homes that flooded during Matthew suffered the exact same fate. At one point, I read that there was a gauge on the Black River that said that it crested at 31 feet, and again, flooded the homes that suffered that same fate just 2 years before. Some of the other learnings is clearly that the storm left many of the state's most vulnerable hurting. Thousands of people that tried to evacuate the region, they were left stranded because no matter where they turned, they were faced with floodwaters. So it resonated with me when I was listening to the DuPont presentation, as one of the key learnings is definitely that evacuation procedure and how difficult it can be when in the midst of the disaster. And then, of course, this historic flooding, it pushed some of the key infrastructure throughout the region to its breaking points. Several dams failed, bridges over very important roads to access or to get out of the area broke, and that caused, again, people being stranded and stuck in the area. One of the, I guess, positives from the Florence event was that, people do find a way to help each other during these troubled times. And I definitely saw that as a learning, that there was this famous person who has this World Central Kitchen Aid organization. And when they start to see all these people not having access to food, they teamed up with local chefs to serve more than 200,000 meals. So, in disaster, there sometimes is that sense of community that can come together to join forces and really, really help. And then if we can move on to the practical recommendation slide, please. Again, as we saw with DuPont, there is an opportunity to predetermine evacuation routes, and then, of course, educate community members on those routes, as well as, in general, what to do when this type of incident, happens. There's also the opportunity, I know SBP, you're very familiar with this and do a lot of this work, but educating people on the federal aid. So even right now, there are people that have applied for aid that are waiting. Some are getting denied. There's still things you can do if you're not going to be granted the aid. So making sure that residents have clear understanding of what to do in order to get some of that aid, including even knowing where their local office is for their disaster recovery center. And then, of course, educating people about there are programs available that would technically buy out homes that are located in flood zones, or pay to have them fixed to, better face flooding in the future. Of course, I think a practical recommendation is to evaluate now, before another event hits, the critical infrastructure, and look at, what can be done to maybe strengthen and reinforce it. One of the other challenges I read about was that obviously when the flooding hits, mold starts to grow, and how do you begin to look at those flood mold remediation programs as soon as you can. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, one of the key learnings was that, it's the people who are most vulnerable that seem to, really be hit hardest. And right now, there's just a challenge for alternative housing options, especially affordable ones. So trying to understand what happens, where can people stay, how can, different buildings and be maybe modified to act as temporary housing and shelter when a disaster hits. And one of those ideas would be to engage FEMA in their sheltering and temporary essential power program. And then I think another recommendation would be to recognize the humanitarian efforts that really, the people, the community members who really stepped up to help others during the disaster. So in order to ensure that, people continue to do that in the future, there's probably opportunities to have, state and local government do something special to make sure those people are recognized. Then I did include just one other slide, Michael, but that was more just, if you want to go to it, is that as I was doing the research, I know it's so important to be looking at who we could potentially interview when we do the PERC. So these were some of the names that popped up as people I think that we should consider talking to as we dive deeper into Florence. So that is it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. That went a lot smoother than I expected, also in terms of the handover, so that's great. Well done. I have taken some notes and I have some high-level feedback, but I want to look towards our main moderator and trainer today, Karen, to see whether you want to provide some initial feedback, whether you want to open it up first, or how you want to play this.
Michael, this is Rachel. Did we have an additional wildfire one that you were gonna, that was shared late from Daniel?
So Daniel, if you want to make any additions, anything that popped up that hasn't been covered yet, I think that would be the moment. As I said, I was unfortunately not able to include the presentation in this slide deck.
Sure, this is Dan from IBHS, and my apologies to everyone for getting those slides in late and causing this hiccup. But I think the first presentation did a really good job of providing an overview of the event, and so I wouldn't have anything additional to add to that side of it. And as for those of you that have been in the previous sessions, you know that I've often spoke about and looked at the PERC process from the wildfire perspective. I'll just add that when Faraz and I had made a site visit in the middle of December 2018, about 6 months after the fire, we had, 6 weeks after the fire, we had the opportunity to talk to some local residents and homeowners that were in the area, and but without hashing through all those again, I think we heard some of the same messaging that the previous presenters had talked about. So nothing new to add, but as the discussion goes into the PERC process, I'd be happy to chime in on our experiences and think about how we think we can improve them.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Karen.
Yeah, I was interested in moving based on, everyone's experience and what you've shared now about conducting mini PERCs into the questions that you can see on the slide. How was the process? Where was it easy? Where was it a little challenging? How did the interviews go? And did you learn things you didn't expect from any of the interviews? And so I don't know if people just want to jump in or if we should go down our list of presenters. Let's see if people will self-volunteer first.
Okay, so this is Peter Haig. I'm the one that did the PERC for Ellicott City in Maryland outside of Baltimore. And I would say that I barely scratched the surface when it came to interviews. but I could tell doing the minimal interviews that I did that there was a certain sensitivity that you had to be aware of. And it helped, I think, to just have a casual conversation with one or two of the residents and the shop owners to just get a general feel of how they felt about the disaster, how they were looking back on the disaster. There had been a number of outreach efforts by the community to conduct very specific outreach and conduct the planning for future investment. And it would have been great to participate in one or two of those had I known that they were being conducted. Of course, that was back in October, but I think there are community events like that that involve community planning that could offer opportunities to get a sense of how the community is feeling as well. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. Yep. Anyone else?
I can jump in. Hi, this is Jen. As I was conducting the research, I did find it challenging to remain focused because I felt as I was diving into the information, I would, like, you could easily go down a path of focusing on the humanitarian efforts or talking about the very specific types of infrastructure challenges that happened that contributed to the disaster. I mean, there were so many different ways I could go that I think in a way it got a little overwhelming because I at one point just sort of had to stop like reading because I kept going down one path and then I was like, wait a minute, this is going to be too focused on one area. I need to, set that aside and go look at something else. So for me, one of the challenges was just trying to, remain focused. And then, but what did help that is having that overarching question in my hypothesis as my guide, always thinking about what is new about this. This might be very interesting, but is it new? That sort of drew me back to focus and try to put everything together.
Nice, thank you.
Hi, this is Susan Homan. And just one add that I'd like to make is I think that it really makes a difference to have at least two people on the interviews because even as the previous person just mentioned how we're absorbing so much new information or just listening, and certainly did try to keep it casual so that they were very generous with their feedback and just talking. But it was good to have, Chris did this especially well in our interviews of kind of bringing us back to, kind of key points that we wanted to dig into that were more relevant to, rather than letting people just kind of go off on tangents. So I'd say, another, it was easier than I thought to get people to be very open. It was almost the more challenging piece is like you can go on for hours and kind of, go off on tangents. And that's where I think that, having two people to kind of watch what's going on, so you have one that can just be more helpful in bringing the discussion back to, purposeful, answers for you.
Thanks. I think that's a really interesting reflection, Susan. And I note also that, it looks like you and Chris have quite different backgrounds. And that's something that we've always tried to do with our interview teams is have a two-person team with different backgrounds. Because yes, then you have two people tracking from sort of different perspectives. And it, I think, does help with the fact that you're getting a whole lot of new information and there may be different elements that you want to dive in a little deeper. And also that it is easy often to get people to be really open and that And that often it does feel like they would go on for hours if you gave them the opportunity. And timekeeping is something we've always been really careful with. As a result, that if we ask people for a 1-hour interview, that we respect that, even if they seem ready to go on and on and on, and we have the time to do that, to at least say, you know, I'm aware that we've been here for 55 minutes and we don't want this to take up your whole afternoon. We're happy to continue if you'd like, but we can also put a hard stop to this in 5 minutes, just so that they have the space and it doesn't go on in ways that they didn't anticipate and later regret. Anyone else?
I think we're missing the ICLR colleagues. If they have anything to add, that would be great. Then at least all the presenters were able to speak on their own reflections.
And SPP, and I would love to hear from the SPP team because you are so grounded, and the information you presented sort of reflected that you were on the ground in Sandy for quite some time and had a much deeper engagement than the rest of these mini PERCs presented.
I'm sure I can make a point. This is Kenzie from ICLR.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar to a point that was just brought up. I would say something that's challenging about doing a PERC, but similar to most research, is just finding your focus and deciding on what questions you really want to answer doing the PERC. And even though this one was just a little mini one, it's still just figuring out how are we going to focus this and how are we going to make sure that even though it's really focused, making sure that we're still looking at a diverse group of people and how the event impacted them.
Thanks, Kenzie. Yes, I would agree. That's always a challenge.
Yeah, and this is Mark with SVP. I'm from the state of New York, not from New York City, but started with SVP doing Sandy recovery. And I think something that has popped up to me, and Peter, I think you hit the nail right on the head, is that sensitivity when conducting the interviews is really important. I think this analysis is really important, looking at it from a unbiased and from the 10,000-foot level, because we have to make a hard assessment of what went well and what were some of the things that led to these disasters so that we can prevent them in the future. But we just have to be aware of that emotional connection that people have to these events. Some people think of an event like Sandy similar to how some people in New York think about 9/11, in that they lost a lot of personal items, they lost a job, or they lost family members. So, Peter, I just wanted to really appreciate your perspective there on that sensitivity in the interviews there. And then I think trying to get the whole holistic and a real diverse set of interviews is truly important, because not just from the perspective of the different aspects of response and disaster and recovery, but for the different perspectives of what went wrong and the different lenses that people had both during the disaster and post-disaster. A government official will understand and will see a lot of high-level aspects, but frequently their focus may be on the infrastructure, or it may be on the economic development, or it may be on the city or the community's assets that they have to ensure are repaired and are functioning from the municipal perspective for them to recover. But they may not have a focus on the social emotional well-being of the community or the housing recovery. So I think that diversity in the people that we interview and understanding the different focuses that they might have or the perspective they have is really important to getting a full picture of what not only the immediate damage is and the ways to improve, but what the path moving forward here is. And understanding that the recommendations that we make, and again, I think Peter said this as well, it's been 2 years, but these things unfortunately take a lot of time, even when it comes to planning, when it actually comes to implementing an infrastructure project. Outside of disasters, we know that New York has many infrastructure challenges. and that the solutions are extremely expensive. So I think when thinking about our recommendations, we also should be aware of, the cost and the time that it will take to implement those recommendations as well.
Thanks, Mark. Michael, did you have pieces you wanted to jump in with?
So first of all, thanks everyone for contributing and taking such an active role. I think this was a job very well done. Definitely better than I expected, so thank you. In terms of the reflection, so what I first noted down is something that was also said earlier. People felt like scratching the surface barely with doing this mini PERC. And I think that was to be expected. So obviously with a, kind of a full-size PERC, you would be able to dig a lot deeper. And that's almost like, a small child continuously repeating the question, but why, as you get an answer. So the evacuation system didn't really work. Why is that? Because some of these roads were, not the same capacity as they were intended to be in the original concept. Why was that the case? So, starting to scratch deeper and probably not, literally asking why to your interviewees, but just in your mind, get a little bit of a reflection. So how can you start digging deeper? So that's definitely something that I picked up throughout your mini PERC studies, and I think that really was to be expected. So highlighting that, there is a second level, a third level that you can uncover to get closer to a fuller picture. And then also what was said in terms of how do you put it together and how do you make sense of the individual pieces that you collect. So definitely working as a team will help you stay a bit focused and framed and avoid you going down one path that you're not necessarily sure will lead you to a fuller picture. And then also making sure that this is a full team effort in the sense that your research team, every other day or every evening, or depending on how you would conduct such a field work, comes back to a central location, bringing all their individual nuggets and pieces, and then trying to make sense of that as a joint team effort. And I think if we go back to this forensic idea, detectives trying to find out the truth, that's maybe the moment where everybody comes back to police headquarters and then puts the various colored pins into the map on the wall and trying to see, what is emerging from those elements. So I think that's exactly this type of forensic approach that you need to take there. What I found really good is also that some of you highlighted that there are solutions available, that there are things that have worked or that could work. And highlight that acting early, investing in prevention, that there are success stories in these disasters is definitely something worthwhile doing and quite important. And I think we highlighted this in the very first webinar. It's not just about uncovering what has not worked and therefore providing recommendations to do something different next time, but also uncovering what has worked and maybe what people are actually not that much talking about, because it is knowledge that may benefit others. And we always need to think this time it may have been Florence in North Carolina, or 5 years ago it may have been Sandy in New York. But where is the next Sandy? Where is the next Florence going to be? And is there time for those not yet, turned into a disaster event? To take action and avoid something that is actually avoidable. So I think sharing those positive messages is also important. Somebody touched upon buyouts and removing homes from where they are really a bottleneck and problematic in floodplains. And I think that also brings up an interesting question around ethics and equity. So where is it fair to do buyouts and at what price, under what conditions? I would say especially in Europe along the Elbe and Danube rivers, removing homes and therefore removing people from where they have lived for maybe a long time or forever is also an ethical question. So how do you do that? Is it actually politically and otherwise acceptable to do that? So I think that also raises some interesting additional questions beyond just the physical, what can you do and how would you implement it? So that's also something to stay aware of. And then ultimately, there's a lot that we could discuss here in terms of certain of your key findings. I found the one around evacuation quite interesting because it points also to the fact that there are very competing interests sometimes. I wouldn't personally argue that, you know, trying to beautify cities and beautify roads is wrong. It's just, you know, if you're interested in attracting maybe a different set of residents or, you know, improving life quality for residents, greening streets, and again, maybe having more of a climate change angle in mind, then you might want to reduce the roads. But that then may create a new bottleneck in terms of wildfire rapid evacuations. So how can you implement one without doing negative consequences on the other? And what does that mean in terms of adapting your evacuation plans? Maybe in terms of our 4 Rs, that means you need to go from rapidity to redundancy. So I think the systems thinking comes in here and making sure you understand if you're changing something for one particular reason, how does that impact on another aspect? So those would be some aspects that I wanted to cover, and hopefully you'll find these comments helpful. And again, I will turn it over to Karen.
And Michael, on that last one, I found that super interesting as well, Chris and Susan, the fact that they had narrowed the roads to 2 lanes, and found myself thinking, well, how could you achieve both? How could you add pedestrian and bike paths, but in a way that when you needed to rapidly repurpose them as an extra evacuation lane, they could serve that purpose? And that, you know, and how could you communicate that to people that, yes, we have put in these bike and pedestrian lanes, but, you know, if we suddenly set off the evacuation sirens, that becomes a driving lane. We want cars there. And that's our second outbound lane, you know, and then we just have the one inbound lane for rescue personnel coming in or something like that. And I think those are those kind of, you know, solutions that provide multiple benefits. They give you the flexibility you want, but they also provide that resilience piece. And so that's sort of kind of the next level of how can we surface some of these opportunities that can serve multiple purposes as part of these studies. I also wanted to just touch on the issue of staying focused. And I think part of where we can also gain that piece of focus is, as you conduct a PERC, think about who your audience is and what you want to be able to tell them. Why are you conducting this PERC? Who are you going to share it with? And consequently, what does that mean about how you might want to, which avenues you might want to sort of dive into as part of your interviews and your background research, but also then how you want to frame what you're learning and frame what you're recommending. And I know most of the PERCs that the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance has conducted so far have been sort of for broader audiences. They've been for, you know, for sharing among practitioner communities, for proving, you know, concept in some places. In Peru, we actually knew that we had an avenue to the national government. And so we did a broader study, but then we also did 2 very focused policy briefs around specific issues we knew they were making decisions about. One of which was the question of buyouts and relocating communities, and with some very specific guidance around the ethics and equity issues. How would you do this in ways that maintain that? And so I think that's also an opportunity. Before we move on, I just want to ask if anyone has questions about things, either what they've heard or about aspects that surfaced while you conducted your PERC. We'll give people just a minute to unmute if they have anything to say, and if not, we'll move on.
Well, I would just jump in and say one thing. There are so many commonalities across the different disasters that we just spoke about today. And I think that the more we see PERCs being conducted, I think it may be an area that's rich for comparisons and kind of a portfolio approach, or possibly even artificial intelligence kind of approach where you start to identify what the commonalities are and help communities with their planning based on some of the patterns that we see as we go forward. And that's probably already something that we can tap from past disasters, but it's striking to hear the same things from different disasters over and over again.
Yes, we would absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, I would add to that, and this harkens back to, our New York situation, because reference was made to the investment that would need to build out the infrastructure to make us more resilient. That investment is perhaps prohibitively expensive. It involves billions of dollars. It may never happen. And it seems to me that one of the many values of PERCs, and especially the comparative piece of it, is the opportunity to share ideas and perhaps low or no cost solutions, to dealing, with these types of situations. I think that that's another value that should not be understated.
And that's a place where we've always tried to balance. Yes, there are certainly some, sort of green infrastructure or other higher dollar activities you could take, but things like communication, that doesn't have to be expensive. Building relationships, that doesn't have to be expensive. And so we do try to strike a balance in the recommendations we've come forward with, and I think most of these mini PERCs identified, a similar range of things. Anyone else? Okay, let's move on. Next slide. So one of the things we wanted to touch on just briefly before we conclude this series of webinars is the whole question of sort of ethics and bias. And, we're coming in from the outside. We're digging into what are, for many people, very sensitive issues, and we're coming in wearing particular hats. We may be seeing this as, we're doing this is just unbiased research, we're interested in learning, but that's not necessarily how people will see us. And so before we concluded this webinar, we wanted to flag, sort of the issues of how would you respond if you are a Zurich employee and you come in, people may well see, okay, you're from an insurance firm. Are you coming in specifically looking for risk information, claims information, risk information? Are you looking for new customers? How would you respond if people make that assumption? For ISET, we come in as a nonprofit, so there's less assumption, but what we have had is, well, are you trying to gather information that you would then use, for consulting bids, or even just why should we talk to you? What do you have to offer in this space? And so I would like people to just think for a minute and did any of you run into these sorts of issues in the people you interviewed, particularly for those of you who perhaps interviewed people outside of your typical immediate list of contacts. You know, Peter, when you walked into businesses, were they very open to talk with you, or did they want to know why you were there and why you were asking these sorts of questions, for example? Is this something anyone faced?
Hi, this is Dan Gorham, and I'll just reflect on the group that we did our site visit with in Paradise. Was a group of insurance company representatives, and some people wore their logoed polos and shirts, and when we approached homeowners, there was some initial, I don't know if skepticism was the right word to describe it, but they saw the insurance logo, and I think that their mind started, you know, the gear started turning, but after 30 to 60 seconds of conversation to explain the reasoning and intent of our being there, and I think when we were with a group of insurance company representatives describing it as not a single company, but essentially a consortium from the industry, that was a good way to diffuse the initial angst. And again, from what we were doing to try and do research and try and collect information to prevent future losses and future disasters, that was an opening to allow the residents to be more free in the interview process.
Nice. Anyone else?
I can add something. This is Kenzie.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was just going to say, I didn't experience with the mini PERC because we interviewed a colleague, but I would say that it's important to be open right away with the intentions of the research, and let those being interviewed know that you're looking for what was done well and things that can be learned for future disasters. But also being open to, if somebody decides that they aren't comfortable doing the interview, even if it's begun, being willing to say, okay, that's fine, like, we don't have to continue. Just giving people the option to decide how, like, if they are comfortable speaking on the event, especially if they experience losing a home or losing someone to the disaster, just being open to how understanding how people feel. So I think it's really important just to build the trust. And also, I think especially if you're working with different communities, like in Canada, for example, if we're working with Indigenous communities, you have to really respect that there's a lot of problems with ethics that have gone on in research for a long time. So, so keeping in mind things like that.
Thanks.
So I would just say, thank you for adding the Indigenous people's component. Language and communication and outreach to different communities is so critical, not to mention the ethics. So good, excellent for me to hear. But the one thing I would also add in terms of conducting interviews, so what we've discussed in the PERC process is first do your desk research. And to me, when I actually went to the location, I could tell that I probably hadn't done enough or sufficient amount of desk research. I could have done more. But then I would say before I actually conducted formal interviews with anyone, actually getting to the location, if at all possible, taking a look around, walking the town, walking the area, driving the area, whatever it might involve, to me was so revealing and actually added so much color to the research that I had conducted that I can't imagine actually having a serious interview with a public official or anyone until I'd actually taken that step. So I would almost suggest adding a step for conducting a little bit of primary research before you start conducting interviews. I'll stop.
Nice, thank you. And this is part of why we go in person to do interviews. You know, in this day and age, we could do them on the phone, but aside from the fact that it's different if you're in a room with someone, talking with them one-on-one, it's also that whole seeing the location, understanding the physical landscape, seeing how people live, seeing how they interact with one another and with the environment around them. All of those are really, they're sort of intangible, but they're, I think, critical to being able to tell a clear story. Anyone else have reflections to add? So one of the other things on sort of related to the ethics and bias issue is about obtaining permissions. We have done a number of these interviews in different ways, and increasingly we're moving toward asking people to sign a permission form saying that they understand we're asking them to do this interview. It's just for informational purposes. It will not be used in any way as part of the Zurich business. And in many cases, even just giving people a release form like that makes them nervous. And so presenting that, but being very relaxed about what we're asking and asking them to sign it. We have also at different times chosen to record interviews. More so often, as Susan reflected, there can be a whole lot of new information. If you're conducting an interview by yourself, particularly if it's with someone where you expect there might be more technical content or more detail, and you want to be sure to capture those numbers accurately or that information, you might want to record it. But again, we always ask up front. And I think in some of our perks, we've had that as a specific element on our consent form. Do you consent to this interview? Do you consent to this interview being recorded? And it's two different signature locations. And again, being very relaxed about, if you don't want to be recorded, that's absolutely fine. This is just for our use to go back. One of the things we have been very clear about in how we conduct our interviews and what we communicate to our interviewees and in how we write our reports is not referring to people by name unless we obtain explicit permission from that person to say, okay, we have a quote from you. Is this quote accurate? And would you be comfortable if we put this in the report with your name on it? But otherwise, as we reference the information we've been given, we are very careful not to provide even information that might, for specific individuals, allow them to trace back, oh, you must have gotten that information from, because we want to be clear that, yes, we're collecting this information, we're putting it together, but we don't want to be putting people on the spot, particularly given that we're not just identifying things that went well, but things that may have been challenging. Rachel, did I miss anything on that?
Sorry, I was just muting myself. I think you covered it, and it's just to emphasize, I think what everybody seems to have understood and has mentioned is just, being as open as possible, just being honest about the purpose of the report and in terms of the consent forms and the interviews will, facilitate this process. So, again, as Daniel talked about with the insurance people that came with their logos, the minute they started talking and explaining the report, it kind of shifted the conversation a little bit. And I think it's important to just, sometimes you just have to continue to explain the report, even if there's kind of an initial maybe pushback of, oh, no, we don't want to talk to you. think if you just pause and say, well, no, try to understand what their resistance is and then continue to explain beyond their initial resistance. And of course, if they continue to say they're not interested, you know, that's that. But I think it's important to recognize that there might be some resistance initially, but if you can keep talking and don't take it personally as well, I think that's one way to get people kind of on your side and understanding, you know, really that we're trying to just pull broad learnings and key insights from the study.
Thanks. Michael, is there anything you'd like to add or anything that anyone else would like to reflect on here?
I have nothing to add. Thank you, Karen.
Okay, next slide. So I'm aware that it's 9 o'clock and that many of the people, most of the people on this call are not going to be part of the more in-depth PERC Florence that we're about to head to the field and conduct next week. I guess there are a couple things I'd like to just share broadly with everyone, and then I think we can probably bring the webinar to a close, and perhaps those of us who are going into the field for PERC Florence want to stay on and just have a slightly more in-depth conversation.
That sounds good, Karen. I would have made exactly the same suggestion, maybe slightly differently. I would actually close the webinar and meeting and stop the recording. Maybe we take then a 5-minute bio break and redial in, so I will open it up again. So dial-in details will be the same, but you would have to actively come back to be part of that if you want to. Other than that, I think in terms of the wider context of this PERC library, and somebody also mentioned it earlier, you know, as the PERC knowledge and insights grows, I think the more of the fundamentals and the underlying challenges will fall out. We have already done a summary of these PERC key findings, but hopefully in, you know, a couple of years' time from now, we would be in a much stronger position to do another one over a much wider range of PERCs. So overall, hopefully participants felt this PERC approach is useful, and they will conduct some of this on their own. And if you could circle back and let us know, contribute actively to the PERC library on floodresilience.net/PERC, so our PERC webpage that we have. And just, you know, provide feedback and insights and let us know what PERC studies have been or PERC-like studies have been published. That would be tremendously helpful. That's really all that I wanted to add, Karen.
Sounds good. Does anyone else have last thoughts then before we close this call? Okay, well, thank you all for being part of this, for your interest in the PERC, and for this great collection of mini PERCs. It was really fun to see where everyone took this, and the really interesting and in many cases really deep learnings that you arrived at, even with a really light touch. So thank you all.
Likewise for me, thank you all so much for attending. Hopefully you have learned a lot and you're excited to do more of this. Again, we're open for any feedback and comments, so please do circle back to us. And with that, I will stop the recording and then share the recording